I will introduce our speakers tonight in reverse order of their remarks, starting with Senator Graham, who will directly follow Senator Lugar to the podium without any interference from me, which is something many people would be happy to hear. Robert Graham was governor of Florida from 1979 to 1987 and served the state as United States Senator from 1987 to 2005. He served 10 years on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and chaired the committee from 2001 to 2003. It was from this perch that he opposed the prospect of war against Iraq. In addition to 3 nonfiction books, Senator Graham published a novel, The Keys to the Kingdom, which is really about life in Washington or something. Since leaving the Senate, he has founded the Bob Graham Center for Public Service at the University of Florida, where he spent his undergraduate days. Speaking of where someone spent his undergraduate days, Richard Lugar represented Indiana in the Senate from 1977 to 2013. He was chair of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations from 2003 to 2007. He was named an outstanding legislator by the American Political Science Association, perhaps one of the most worthwhile things the American Political Science Association has ever done. He received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2013, along with Ernie Banks, Daniel Kahneman, Loretta Lynn, and Gloria Steinem. And that's not even the top of the list. Bill Clinton and Dean Smith were also involved. Along with Sam Nunn, Democratic senator from Georgia, Senator Lugar sponsored the Nunn-Lugar Act to help dismantle more than 7,500 nuclear warheads, as well as other weapons of mass destruction material. He was mayor of Indianapolis from 1968 to 1976 and had the unique distinction of being Richard Nixon's favorite mayor. He currently leads the Lugar Center, which, among other things, has constructed a bipartisan index by which we can evaluate political polarization. Recently, Chicago Tribune editorial writer David Rudder wrote of Senator Lugar, and I quote, "He was a thinker who had served the entire planet. He was a deep man. We don't do deep so much anymore." It is my pleasure to introduce Senator Richard Lugar, to make some remarks about political polarization, who will be followed directly by Senator Bob Graham.
Well, I'm deeply honored to welcome all of you to this first inaugural Lugar Symposium. I'm excited to be a part of the program this evening. It's been constructed under the visionary direction of Dr. Andrew Katz, who leads the Lugar program in politics and public service here at Denison. I'm indebted to President Adam Weinberg for his steady encouragement of my association with Denison, his energetic leadership of the university, and his personal friendship. It's also a very special privilege to be reunited with my colleague, Senator Bob Graham, and members of his family. We served 18 years together in the United States Senate, during which time I developed a deep respect for his thoughtful approach to legislating and devotion to our nation's security and prosperity. I want to begin tonight by sharing something that I did this year that very few public figures have done recently. I admitted to being a member of the Republican establishment. Now, Renee Montaigne of National Public Radio began an interview earlier this year by suggesting that I might fit the description of a member of the Republican establishment, and she asked me if I would agree. We had a nice laugh together, but I confessed that I would be a good suspect. Anything associated with the establishment of the right or the left, of course, is not in favor in the current American political climate. Though few can define exactly what is meant by the establishment, it has become a code word in the presidential election for real and imagined failures in Washington, D.C. This isn't anything especially new. Presidential primary elections almost always feature candidates who bill themselves as outsiders, striving to change the process. This appeal to voters from outside the system is a natural and useful part of our democracy that stretches back at least as far as Andrew Jackson. Yet there are elements of the candidacies of self-described outsiders in this election that are breaking the mold. Most of the notable anti-Washington candidates of the past 4 decades were experienced governors who vowed to bring to the federal government the successful practices and programs that they had honed in their states. Among these were winning candidates such as Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush. All communicated detailed programs and legislative visions during their campaigns. In contrast, the most successful outsiders of this cycle, Donald Trump and Ted Cruz, have no experience as a governor or mayor. Ted Cruz occupies a Senate seat, but his tenure has been short, and he's devoted his time to institutional opposition rather than legislating. Moreover, in this election, too often, an anti-establishment posture has been used as an excuse for irresponsible behavior and statements. This draws attention and distinguishes a candidate from the crowd, but ultimately it hurts the reputation of the United States of America and our own political process. Frequently, candidates have excused their incivility by saying that they are giving voice to an angry majority. Elections create storylines, and myths, in part because reporters and commentators need points of reference on occasion. Now, this year, one of the dominant storylines has been the rise of the angry voter. Implicit in this storyline is that voter anger is justified and will only be relieved by overturning the system. I have no doubt that some voters are motivated by their anger, and some of this is justified by failures in our political culture. But the results of this anger are not always validating. Anger disconnected from a realistic reform agenda and lacking in respect for pluralistic views is not a political virtue. It is possible for anger to be real and heartfelt, but simultaneously misguided and destructive. We know from numerous lessons of history that popular anger can be manipulated in ways that lead to intolerance, civil unrest, violence, and self-destructive national policies. The current presidential candidates are not the first to stoke this anger. In a terrific piece in the New York Times last weekend, which has been mentioned already, Arthur Brooks of the American Enterprise Institute distinguished between the ideal of a, quote, competition of ideas, end of quote, and the reality of our current political commentary, which, and I quote again, is more contemptuous than angry, overflowing with sneering, mockery, and disgust, end of quote. But even though the candidates have not originated this divide, their behavior has excused the growing disrespect Americans have for fellow citizens with different political views. A study published last year in the American Journal of Political Science by Shanto Lugar and Sean Westwood found that discrimination against opposing partisans frequently exceeds discrimination based on race. Moreover, the authors underscored, and I quote, unlike race, gender, and other social divides where group-related attitudes and behaviors are constrained by social norms, there are no corresponding pressures to temper disapproval of political opponents. If anything, the rhetoric and actions of political leaders demonstrate that hostility directed at the opposition is acceptable, even appropriate, end of quote. The American political system clearly is failing in some dramatic ways. In my view, the principal cause of this failure is the widening partisan gulf, which many of our presenters tomorrow have attempted to study and to quantify, and I look forward to hearing their papers. And yet the answer of many voters to these deficiencies has been to support candidates who exemplify partisanship, confrontation, and political coarseness. We are at risk of attempting to solve our problems by doubling down on their main cause. In the process, this election cycle has devalued many traditional political virtues that most Americans have embraced for decades, if not for centuries. At the risk of damning these traits for the moment, let's call them establishment virtues. I would focus on 4 of them: civility, experience, seriousness, and compromise. Now, most, if not all of us, would say that these 4 traits are desirable in our political system and in our individual candidates, and indeed in our interpersonal relationships. All of us prefer people in our lives who treat others well. We hire people ranging from doctors to plumbers to professional athletes based on their experience and their qualifications for the job. We celebrate studiousness in both youth and adults so that we can advance our understanding of the world. And we embrace the need for compromise in resolving personal and business disputes. Yet in this election cycle, we have seen these virtues not just de-emphasized, but often scorned. Civility is equated with weakness, experience with corruption, seriousness with pedantry, and compromise with a lack of principles. Instead, candidates have run on vacuous and sometimes cartoonish proposals that lack any political realism or programmatic details. Carpet bombing ISIS, deporting 11 million undocumented immigrants, having Mexico pay to build a wall blocking the entire length of our southern border, may be powerful cathartic symbols, but such proposals cheapen political debate and alarm friends and our allies abroad. Even Bernie Sanders' call for free tuition at all public colleges funded by taxes on Wall Street is little more than an aspirational talking point that glosses over the consequences such a plan would have for the viability of private colleges, the quality of university education, the ability of universities to conduct research, the size of budget deficits, and numerous other factors. This would be a fascinating political science and linguistic experiment if we weren't engaged in the very serious business of electing a President of the United States and our Congress. Clearly, the 4 virtues I have cited are not just establishment virtues, they are American virtues, because they are necessary for the orderly and productive operation of our Constitution, and they have been tested by generations of Americans who found that good governance depends on them. A reading of constitutional era literature underscores how much the framers valued compromise among well-informed, experienced leaders who would work with each other in a civil framework of laws. Like many of our panelists who we will hear tomorrow, the Lugar Center has taken up the challenge in attempting to measure and to define what is happening in American political life. A primary interest is our bipartisan index, which was developed in cooperation with the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University. The index measures the frequency with which members of Congress co-sponsor bills introduced by the other party, and the frequency with which their own bills are co-sponsored by members of the other party. We have released scores for the 113th Congress, the first session of the current Congress, and lifetime scores for the Senate that stretch back to 1993. Not only do we have scores for individual members, we've been able to track the performance of the entire House and Senate since 1993. Our data shows a steep decline in bipartisan behavior surrounding bill sponsorship and co-sponsorship beginning in 2001. The scores reached their nadir in the 112th Congress before a slight uptick in the last 113th Congress. But the last 2 full Congresses were by far the least bipartisan among the 11 we have studied. We also found that our formula ranked the two surviving current members of Congress in the presidential race, Ted Cruz and Bernie Sanders, as the two least bipartisan senators in 2015. Consistent with this, our historical Senate scores found that a generational shift has taken place regarding the willingness of new senators at the progressive and conservative ends of their parties to engage in bipartisanship. For example, we found the Republicans who began their Senate careers since 2005 occupied 9 of the bottom 12 spots among the 227 senators who have served since 1993. All 9 of these contemporary Republicans have significantly lower lifetime bipartisan scores than the late Senator Jesse Helms, who was considered to be the most conservative Republican in the 1980s and 1990s. Similarly, on the Democratic side, we found that current liberal senators with far lower scores than liberal icons of the past, such as Ted Kennedy, Paul Wellstone, Daniel Inouye, John Kerry, Tom Harkin, to name a few. I would also note that Senator Bob Graham, my colleague tonight on the platform, had an excellent lifetime score. Right on, Bob. He ranked 35th out of the 227 senators in the study. And this is long before I knew we were going to be together this evening. I take the long view that the current partisan era, like the past partisan eras, does not have to last forever. The pendulum can swing back with surprising speed. My hope is that it will not take a grave crisis that threatens the safety and prosperity of our nation to rekindle a broader appreciation of civility, experience, studiousness, and compromise in our political leaders. I would conclude with a simple declaration that represents my own vision of what candidates should communicate when running for high office. I'm grateful that Senator Bob Graham is here today because I know that he brought these sentiments to his own long service to our nation. I affirm that members of the other party love their country and are people of goodwill, and I will avoid portraying them as unpatriotic or disloyal. I believe that members of the opposing party can contribute to good policy. I will explore opportunities to work with them and will attempt to include them in early deliberations on my initiatives. I recognize that bipartisan support from elected officials broadens public acceptance of new laws and policies and improves the chances they will be successfully implemented. Even as I participate in partisan debates and work on behalf of my party, my first motivation will be a careful reflection on what is good for our country. I will avoid legislative and policy actions that have no purpose other than to score partisan political points. Although I will advance arguments consistent with my own political philosophy, I will study issues in depth with an open mind, and I will consider multiple points of view and avoid an exclusive reliance on my party's politicians and their positions and talking points. I will maintain my civility, even when others around me do not. I will measure my words to avoid inflammatory rhetoric that often is destructive to the political process and to our national unity. Now, such a statement would not play well in our current political environment, perhaps, but I believe that most Americans recognize that we have to find ways to resolve our disputes and to work together again. I appreciate all that each of you are doing through your work, your study, and your personal interactions to advance political understanding and bring greater unity to American society. Your presence this evening testifies to this very strongly. I thank you very much.
Thank you. I will give you my conclusion at the beginning. I endorse precisely what Senator Lugar has just said in his conclusion, and that shall be mine as well. I might say I don't have to announce my position on the political spectrum. I follow the Will Rogers admonition that I have never belonged to an organized political party. I am a lifetime Democrat. I want to thank President Weinberg and Professor Katz and Senator Lugar for their vision in organizing this symposium and for the contributions that they have all made to the causes of the Lugar Center and the cause of enhanced citizen engagement. I'm a Southerner, and one of the things that we Southerners like to do is to tell stories. So settle back, you're going to hear a few. The first is one that maybe Dick might not want to hear because of the consequence that came from this chance meeting. But in 1985, I was in my 7th year as governor of Florida and thinking, what was I going to do with the rest of my life? One of the options was to run for the U.S. Senate. But frankly, this was at a time when the Senate was having some difficulty meeting its full responsibility, and a number of prominent members had recently retired. I was invited to a dinner of the board of directors of the Gannett Publishing Company, one of whom was one of those recently retired senators, Howard Baker of Tennessee. And I ended up sitting next to Senator Baker, and I told him that I was trying to decide what to do, and that frankly I had about dismissed running for the Senate because of what I had seen, including his own withdrawal. And he said, Mr. Graham, don't read too much into this. There are some very bright younger people coming into the Senate who are going to recapture its distinctive qualities. One of those is a former mayor of Indianapolis, and his name is Richard Lugar. He's the kind of person that you would like to serve with. Well, Richard, that was such a convincing argument that I did, in fact, run. And he modestly defeated an incumbent Republican and contributed to the Democrats taking control of the Senate in 1987. So I thank you, and I apologize for any inconvenience that may have caused. I'm going to talk about 3 things tonight. One, I'm going to talk about some of the consequences that may not be obvious on the surface of the level of parochialization that has occurred in our Congress. 2, some effort at diagnosis of the problem and a little bit of prescription of what we might do about it. But before I turn to that, I want to again thank Denison University for what they are making available to us tonight, and particularly for what they have made available to my family. You are in the company of 3 generations of the Graham family. My wonderful wife, Adele, our wonderful daughter, Suzanne, and to show the fact that evolution is in fact true and generations continue to improve, our spectacular granddaughter and junior at Denison University, Ansley Gibson. Now let me tell a second story. This is actually about a place and 2 stories. The place is a room in back of the Senate dining room in the Capitol. I'm certain that many of you have been to the Senate dining room, which is open to members of the Senate, even retired members of the Senate and their guests. There's another room in back of that room, which is for senators only currently serving senators. It was a place to go not only to have a good lunch, but you could sit down with your colleagues in a quiet, out of the spotlight environment and talk about what was happening, and frequently arrive at some compromises that maybe hadn't occurred before. I was participating in one of those activities in 1995, and the first of our three generations is coaching me on how to get closer to the microphone. 1995, and in the midst of a quiet lunch, a senator whose name I have forgotten came into the room huffing and puffing and very excited, and we asked, what is happening? And he said, well, there are members of the House Ways and Means Committee who are in Statuary Hall yelling and screaming profanity at each other. Well, one of the senators who was having lunch that day was Patrick Moynihan. With the exception of Dick Lugar, the smartest person that I ever served with in public office. In fact, Moynihan had this reputation. He was the best thinker among politicians since Abraham Lincoln, and the best politician among thinkers since Thomas Jefferson. That's pretty fast company. He got up in response to this and said, let me tell you a story. In 1804, Thomas Jefferson was president. The Capitol building was moving forward. One of the architects of the Capitol was a man named Benjamin Henry Latrobe. They met in what is now Statuary Hall. It was the original House of Representatives chamber. And they had a boisterous, assertive debate. The debate was over the subject of, did American traditions come more fully from the Greek experience or the Roman experience, and how to reflect that in the final design of this important chamber of the Capitol. Moynihan said, how much we have changed. 200 years ago, our leaders were discussing the philosophy that founded our country. Today, they yell profanities in that same room. I think in many ways it was that period that was the beginning of the decline of the civility that Senator Lugar so well represented. There have been some serious consequences of the polarization. It's not just theory. I'm going to mention two of them. First is the United States Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court had a long tradition of having diversity among its members. It was not necessarily what we tend to think of diversity today, but it was diversity in terms of the human experience that those 9 people had. Think about, for instance, the period in the 50s and the 60s when the court desegregated our country. It changed some of the fundamental political systems in our country, such as the way in which legislative and congressional districts were drawn to make them more democratic. On that Supreme Court, you had a former governor, you had a former U.S. attorney, you had 2 private practitioners, you had a former United States senator, and a former National Football League running back. Now that's a pretty diverse set of folks. On today's United States Supreme Court, 8 of the 9 members came to the court from the federal appellate bench, one of the most monastic positions that you could have in the U.S. government. And the 9th member, the newest member, was the dean of the Harvard Law School, and as a graduate of that institution, I can tell you that it is equally monastic to the federal appellate courts. And this court, and I without partisanship, because I think it applies to both sides, has issued a series of opinions which are based on the theoretical jurisprudence, completely immune to what its real impact is going to be on human beings that will be affected. Things like the Citizens United case, which was based on the theory that corporations were humans, humans had the right of free speech, therefore corporations should have the right of free speech. The right of free speech included the ability without limit to contribute to the microphone that would amplify the free speech, and thus corporations which previously had been restrained were no longer restrained, and limits on how much could be contributed were eliminated. I think that was a direct result of the fact that presidents have become very risk adverse in recommending persons for the United States Supreme Court. Can you imagine what would have happened to Wizard White if he were nominated today, or if an Earl Warren with his record as governor of California were to have been nominated? It is the most non-controversial persons from the most non-controversial backgrounds that now occupy the Supreme Court and have led to the court becoming a very theoretical institution. The second consequence of polarization is in the intelligence community, an area that I had the opportunity to observe up close and personal for a decade. We have seen a partisanship of the congressional oversight of the intelligence community that was precisely the reason that the current structure was established. After scandals in the 1960s and 70s, where the United States was properly charged with having been involved in the murder of people like the president of Chile and several Central American leaders, the Congress developed a new set of standards for the intelligence community, including committees of the Congress to oversee their activities. And those committees were designed to be apartisan. They had an equal number regardless of the number in the body as a whole. They had a single staff which was responsible to the whole committee, as opposed to the traditional Democratic staff and Republican staff. And they had a strong culture of a responsibility to be the eyes and ears of the American people on an activity of the federal government, which for most purposes was beyond the view of Americans. That system, I think, worked very well up until beginning in the late 1990s, when many of those became eroded. And I believe it was a direct result of the polarization of the body, that the idea that there would be a place that would ignore an ethos which had taken over was unacceptable. And so now there are separate staffs. There has been an injection of a considerable degree of partisan philosophy into the oversight of the intelligence agency. And it came at a particularly inauspicious time. During the Cold War, the intelligence communities developed certain ways of operation that were related to the nature of the relationship between the United States and a large empire, the Soviet Union. With the fall of the Soviet Union, suddenly we were not without adversaries, but they were a different type of adversaries. They were people who lived in caves. They were people who were not part of nation states. They were people from parts of the world with which we had had relatively limited previous experience. That was precisely the time that we needed an active congressional oversight to assure that the reforms necessary to relate the intelligence community most effectively to the new targets was in place. And I'm afraid with the exception of a short burst of energy that occurred immediately after 9/11, there was not much of that necessary reform. And when you read why is it that we are surprised that ISIS has suddenly taken some action, or why has a group with an impronounceable name in Africa adopted a particular set of policies. Polarization of the Congress isn't the first thing you might think about as why that's occurred, but it is, I can tell you, a significant basis of it. In terms of why we have had this polarization, and Mr. Katz told us that we had exactly 20 minutes, and I have used 17 minutes of that. I think there are a number of reasons, and I will just quickly mention some of those. A former senator from Florida, Spencer Holland, once said the thing that caused polarization of the Congress was the jet airplane, that before the jet airplane, people had their life pattern was to come to Washington the first week in January, work 5 days a week, not go home on the weekends, but rather socialize with their colleagues and their families, develop real bonds of understanding and friendship. And then at the 4th of July, Congress had finished all of its work, passed all the appropriations bills, and they went home for 6 months. Once the jet airplane was in place, when the Orlando Chamber of Commerce says, Senator, we would like you to come on Friday night to speak to our annual meeting, unless you wanted to offend the 1,000 members of the Orlando Chamber of Commerce, you accepted their offer, which meant that you couldn't be in session on Friday, which meant that you didn't have those opportunities to get to know your colleagues, and fundamentally changed the character of the American Congress, so blame it on Boeing. I think another factor is that politics tends to be a reflection of the society that it serves. And our society has had a number of cycles that it goes through over time. One of those is the cycle of, is it me or is it an us society? The Great Generation was a representative of a we period in American history, from the Great Depression through World War II. I'm afraid that for the past several years, we have been deepening into a me society. And I would present those oratorical flights of the current candidates on both parties for the President of the United States, all of which will no doubt appear in the 100 greatest speeches of the 21st century, as illustrative of that me society. I think parties have a responsibility. Used to be that there were desks at Ellis Island where, as the new arrivals came off the boat, they were encouraged to start the process that would eventually lead to citizenship. It was the attitude of partisan politics was to try to grow their membership. Today, the policy for both parties is to restrain voting, to get out our base and hope everybody else stays home. The media have been a factor because of their the now 24/7 hard right or hard left substance and content. You can tell when you go into a barber shop what kind of place you're in by whether they're watching Fox or MSNBC. But I think, in my opinion, the most significant cause, and the one that we may have the greatest opportunity to actually do something about, is education. And I've got 45 seconds. America stopped teaching about what it means to be a citizen in democracy in the 1970s. We've had 2 generations of Americans who have had virtually no exposure to concepts like compromise and tolerance and the role that they play in our democratic system. I think that it would be, what would the consequences have been in 1970 if we stopped teaching arithmetic? What difference would America be? It would be about as mathematically deficient as we are today civically deficient, because we did, in fact, stop teaching Americans about democracy. I think a challenge to all of us who are in some ways part of the education community is to restore civics to the Jeffersonian standard, that it was a primary purpose of education to prepare our people to understand their rights and responsibilities and to equip them with the competencies to discharge those rights and responsibilities to their neighbors and their nation. That, to me, is the challenge that education in America faces today, and that is the challenge, when met, will allow us to be worthy of the conclusion of Richard Lugar as to what it means to be a responsible, contributing member of the body politics of America. Thank you.
Thank you, Senators. If there are any questions, we have some time for questions, so if you would come up to where the microphones are in the aisle.
In any event, I'm hopeful that we will, in fact, come back to the point at which we're thinking about programs and disciplines that are going to be required to be successful in foreign policy or in economics, job creation, whatever we're doing. I mentioned that many times candidates in the past had been governors, mayors, and had done work that required them to have a program, to have at least some background that gave confidence to people, some leadership if they were going to the Congress. But at the same time, had the civility to be able to listen to others, to understand that you got a treaty, you need a 2/3 vote. You really have to continually be working across the aisle and listening to others.
Well, my main concern about presidential politics 2016 is I hope that a whole generation of young people don't believe this is the way that democracy is supposed to work. Well, as I said, I've never belonged to an organized political party, but and don't listen to this, Hillary, but I am stunned that John Kasich has not gotten more traction, and I'm not saying that just because we're sitting in Ohio. I don't know him nearly as well probably as Dick does, but what I knew while we were serving together in the Congress was that he was a very skillful, serious person with a creative mind, and I think those are pretty good starting qualities for a president of the United States. So although in a closed primary, I can't vote for John Kasich, to me he's a very attractive candidate.
I would second the motion. I had the opportunity to travel with John Kasich on several occasions abroad during Foreign Relations Committee work, and I was impressed with his ability to grasp quickly what was occurring in other nations and its relationship to what we were doing in Congress. So you ask, among those that still survive, one could say that there are a lot of other people in the Republican Party or the Democratic Party who might have run for Congress. But the facts of life are that there are these three candidates on the Republican side that remain, and John, I believe, is the best qualified of the three. Well, I'll start by saying I agree with Graham that the Citizens United decision was really a very unfortunate decision for our country. I cannot imagine something that is quite so awesome as the hundreds of millions of dollars now being put into the system, most of it anonymously, so that we really have no idea where it came from, but we do have to see some of the impact, and that is not going to work. I'm hopeful that a subsequent court decision will modify that very substantially.
Can I tell you one more quick story? In the early 60s, the Supreme Court had a case called Baker versus Carr, which involved the congressional redistricting of Tennessee, which had not changed its congressional districts since 1900. 60 years, same lines, wildly out of balance. The lower courts had dismissed this case based on Supreme Court precedent that these decisions were political, not judicial. It gets to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is almost at a point that it will not give the necessary 5 votes to take jurisdiction of the case, to hear it, until Senator Hugo Black of Alabama, who was one of the most discredited nominations by Franklin Roosevelt. He'd been a member of the Ku Klux Klan, was an avowed racist, but he was confirmed. Black knew enough about politics from his own life that he understood that if, given the reality of the situation, if the court did not intervene, America was, for the indefinite future, going to be consigned to a significantly less democratic process than it should be. And he was able, drawing on his personal experiences, to convince enough of the members to take the case, and then on a 7-2 vote, the court overturned the congressional district in Tennessee and led to one of the most significant changes in American political representation in our history. So I think that it's recognizing that this is a democracy made up of human beings, each of whom brings their own special talents and experiences to the decision-making process, and that we don't need to succumb to just those human beings who happen to have the most ammunition in the form of campaign money at their disposal, but rather who can bring these broader values that are critical to a visionary and long-functioning democratic process.
Thank you, Senators. Thank you all for coming. The symposium will resume tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. in a different venue, but please check your programs and feel free to join us. Thank you. Good night.